This set of notes is titled Events in the Vietnam War, Part 1. We're talking about so many events that we're going to break it into two parts. So, U.S. military involvement in Vietnam actually starts with President Eisenhower. We've talked before about how under Truman, we had sent over money to help France try to hold on to Vietnam. But once France was defeated, and Vietnam ended up in a civil war, North versus South. President Eisenhower decides that the South needs some help. So he sends over our very first troops, nearly 700 advisors, to help train the South Vietnamese army, which in the textbook, when you see ARVN, that's talking about the South Vietnamese army. And so here in the picture you see Eisenhower actually meeting with President Diem, the president of the South. After Eisenhower comes Kennedy. And Kennedy increased that number of advisors to 16,000, right? Which gives you a sense, right, that things were not going well for South Vietnam. And we know from reading the textbook that President Diem led a pretty corrupt, brutal government, and the army was very ineffective. And with U.S. approval, President Diem actually was overthrown. But still, up to this point, our role is as advisors. Those 16,000 troops that are there training the South Vietnamese army to try to win their own war. Kennedy was assassinated shortly after Diem, and so Vietnam fell to President Johnson. So in 1964, a couple important things happened. One was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So initially, there was an attack on a U.S. ship, and Johnson warned North Vietnam not to do it again. Then there were reports of a second attack, and they looked into it, believed that an attack had occurred, and so Congress authorized President Johnson to do basically whatever he felt was needed to protect U.S. forces in Vietnam. This was the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So pretty much gave Johnson a blank check to do whatever he felt was necessary to protect our forces. So Johnson used that power to start a bombing campaign, massive amounts of airstrikes against North Vietnam. And then later on, we learned that actually that second attack had not occurred. So the next year, 1965, there was an important event at a military base at a place called Pleiku, where the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong attacked and killed 8 Marines. President Johnson uses that event as the reason for sending ground troops into Vietnam. Right? He says, okay, enough's enough. The South is not getting it done. We need to send in troops. At that point, Johnson pretty much takes over the war. He Americanizes the war. And from 1965 onward, this is an American war. By 1968, we had 500,000 men in Vietnam, 500,000 soldiers, right? So remember, we started out with 700 that were just there to help. And after Johnson Americanizes the war, those numbers of soldiers go up and up and up and up till they hit about 500,000. Also in 1968, an important event occurs to change public opinion. And it happened during a holiday called Tet. It was a holiday that really both sides celebrated, and normally there was a ceasefire. But in 1968, the Viet Cong, those communist fighters, the communist rebels in the South, launched a surprise attack. And they attacked several places at the same time. One of those was the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And they actually got through the embassy walls. They attacked several bases in the South. And even though the U.S. very quickly regained control, what became known as the Tet Offensive changed public opinion in the United States. When they saw these bases being attacked, when they saw our embassy being attacked, many Americans became convinced that this was simply an unwinnable war. Shortly after that, President Johnson made a startling announcement that he did not believe he would have the support to win re-election. And so instead of focusing on re-election, he would focus on Vietnam. So he stunned really everybody by announcing he would not seek re-election. So we're going to stop there. That takes us through some important events in 1968. We'll pick up with another set of notes. It'll actually be a lecture and look at really the next part of the Vietnam War and what happens under President Nixon.